I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Robert Morrison. I've known Rob for quite a long time, since I was a PhD student, and he's always been really supportive of my research, and I know he's been supportive of that of many other people as well. Robert has published all kinds of work in the field of romantic print culture and periodicals, essayists, Thomas de Quincey, most notably his biography, I think, was it 2009?
2009, yeah.
A really fantastic book about Thomas de Quincey, and lots of other things as well. He was involved very heavily in the big Thomas de Quincey edition, as John Whale was a few years ago. So it's really great to have you here, Robert. I'm really looking forward to the seminar.
Very embarrassing. Let's get past all that. Okay, thank you very much. David and I sort of chatted about the reading list that I came up with. And last night I said to David, like, what am I meant to do? And we thought it was a good idea if I just spoke for a few minutes about what I tried to cover with the reading list, and then we can break off and chat into groups. Jane's the leader of my group. and then we'll meet back here and we'll chat about what we chatted about. That seems a sensible way. Okay, so one of the things I tried to do is that I tried to choose a weekly, a monthly, and a quarterly. That is to say, Leigh Hunt edited a weekly Examiner. The London Magazine or Blackwood's Magazine or the New Monthly Magazine is a monthly. That comes out every month. And it started me thinking about what's the difference between, in terms of economics or in terms of the kinds of things you write. If you write for a quarterly, it's much, much longer. It's once every 3 months. If you write for a magazine, it's over and over again every month. And Leigh Hunt, think of Leigh Hunt having to produce every week. So we tried to get an example of each of the main organizations of the periodical press, weekly, monthly, and quarterly. The other thing we tried to do was cover a fairly broad period of time. So the Analytical Review is 1788, and Blackwood's and the London are fighting in the 1820s. And of course, we heard about Fraser's yesterday, which was founded in 1830. So we've got this quite nice stretch of time. One of the things that occurred to me as I reread these articles is something that I always think about when it comes to periodical press, and that is that something like a magazine, Blackwood's, has a very clear, strong, loud house style. You can tell when you walk into. Someone said yesterday, those lines, the Coward says of Wordsworth, if I'd seen these lines running wild in the deserts of Arabia, I should instantly have called out Wordsworth. Well, you have this sense, I think reading Blackwood's Magazine, that's a Blackwood's Magazine article. But you can't keep asking people to buy the same thing over and over again without it getting dull. And so a magazine like Blackwood's has always got this tension within it between looking for variety, let's kick around Keats this month, let's go after David Ricardo next month, and coming across with the same kind of strong, clear house style. And so that combination of consistency and variety and what that means to a culture institution like a magazine, how you catch that line between being always interesting and really saying the same version of conservatism over and over and over again. How do you do that? And one of the ways that Blackwood's did it is something like the Noctes Ambrosianae, which is the magazine talking about the magazine. And that kind of irony and play and playfulness, I think, works very, very well. So David asked me to write 3 questions, and so I just thought I'd read out those questions just briefly and just say maybe a word or two about what I thought I was after. How it occurs, I know not, wrote William Harrison Ainsworth in 1830, but some people never read so well as in a magazine. Wilson, for example, and Lamb, as well as, we might add, Hunt, Hazlitt, De Quincey, Southey, and many others. What was it about the periodical press in this period that led so many major authors to write and read so well? And I guess I started thinking about this morning, and I was thinking of a discussion that John and Greg and I had last night about the Beatles. And the reason I think of the Beatles in this context is because I don't care what McCartney does after 1971. It's just what I want is those 4 guys in that group, and And so it seemed to me that there was a way in which, as consumers, William, that's what we were talking about in our group, as consumers we sort of invest in that cultural, creative community. And when somebody leaves that creative community, it doesn't work for us in the same way, even if what that person is doing is better than what he did, for example, in the Beatles. That group is something that we invest in pretty heavily. And so how it occurs, I know not. Some people never read so well as in a magazine. It seems to me to be revealing that when you read De Quincey and you actually read the magazine that Confessions of an English Open Reader appeared in, that is to say, you start with the first article and you go through, you get a different thing. It's different than when you rip it out of the magazine and put it in a Oxford World Classic. So reading him in the magazine seems to me to be to bring things out that get lost when it's taken out of that context. And I wonder why that happens. What it is, that is to say, about the creative community of a bunch of magazine writers shapes the works in the way that it seems to. So the second is William Blackwood, whom I adore. What a difficulty I have in managing the various and powerful minds who are at work in MAGA, William Blackwood declared of his role as the editor of Blackwood magazine. What does the late 18th and early 19th century periodical press tell us about the task of managing or directing or leading creative community? And two of the articles speak about this sort of corporate group democratic project, and yet it seems to me that you've got to have, like we have the groups assigned to us, and you've got to have a leader for the group. And so I just wanted to sort of explore the tension within a creative community between everybody gets a say, but also it needs organizing principles, and you need leaders who have energy, as we talked about in our group. You've got to have, it just can't be everybody sitting around without any structure. And so William Blackwood was, he ended up fighting with everybody because he wanted it a certain way. And you could have independence and individuality to an extent, but if you're going to be in a creative community like the magazine, for Blackwood, it also had to ring certain bells. And if it didn't, he just didn't publish it. Ask Thomas De Quincey. He just didn't get paid if it wasn't close enough. And John Galt and so it just seemed to me that there's this tension between a community and leadership, direction, managing within that community. And I thought you might be able to think about that by the periodical press. And the third is Richard Cronin's finest study, Paper Poets, routinely fire between rival newspapers and those people who are doing the John Scott. John Scott gets himself killed. He gets himself killed. Newspapers, magazines, reviews. At the same time, the periodical press reached new levels of popularity. To what extent are creative communities dependent upon antagonism, debate, and conflict? And in this regard, I thought of the sort of the paradigm of this, that, and the other. When you are a Blackwood's writer, you're fighting with a London magazine writer, so you're this, you're that. But the other seems to me to be, we're all on the periodical press, and the more times people are talking about being on the periodical press, the more magazines we sell, and so on. So that sometimes I read things where Blackwood wants to devour the London magazine, or vice versa. I think that's the last thing Blackwood wants. What Blackwood wants is a good, strong, healthy enemy. That makes good copy. That makes them. And when Blackwood is attacking London, I think Blackwood thoroughly expects that their readers are reading the London magazine. But you don't get the jokes if you don't you don't get the irony. You don't get the play if you're not reading the magazine that Blackwood is ostensibly wanting to drive from the field. I think that they are polarized between themselves, but they're also very conscious that they're on the periodical press trying to generate money, trying to generate coverage, trying to generate interest, trying to make money. And so there seems to me to be this way in which creative communities can thrive on. I don't want John Scott killed. John Scott killed is a tragedy. But they can thrive on debate, criticism, conflict, etc., etc. So I guess I just wanted to push a little on the community is very cozy, and I guess I just wanted to push a little on the notion that that cozy is necessarily good. It may be that conflict is absolutely necessary to get good things to come out. conflict. And we've agreed that dissent and conflict are very good things that are so that's right. So this should be where you get to say what you want without what was the phrase? The tyranny of the tyranny of politeness. That's what. So if you didn't like these articles, you should say. If you don't like me, you should say. Okay, and we'll do it like that. So I'll just go around like this, if that's okay. So I don't know who the leader was. Great. Okay, great.
We were dealing with Kim Wheatley's article on the setting up of the quarterly. That's a really good piece, and I suppose we touched on a million things, but give them some order. I suppose one of the things that is surprising, wonderfully surprising about the piece is that what you'd expect was, what it would be, the quarterly set up to counter the Edinburgh and has a set of really quite concrete and unified aims, and everybody knows what they're doing. And what's wonderful about the article is that sense that they seem to be intending everything and its opposite. That a hands-on editor and the opposite of that, an editor who's just going to, as it were, arrange the things as they come in. A commercial enterprise that's also not a commercial enterprise. The intent is not to make money, and that I suppose we ended up thinking about it in terms of the dialectical ironies of entering a battle, which is also a game. That on the one hand they want to shoot the Edinburgh out of the water, on the other hand what they're clearly fantasising is a game in which these reviews gain energy and liveliness, as it were, by competing with one another.
Right.
But where the object is not a kind of zero-sum triumph, or that sort of displaced by.
It would be disastrous if one of them collapsed. It's like Caleb Williams sort of. You need to be chased. Yeah.
No, that's right. And so I suppose there's sort of the political model of this being a war against a particular ideological sort of magazine. The commercial model and that worry that they might be very stable and solid as a Tory magazine and yet be dull. And so liveliness is a key, and even a sort of slashing quality perhaps might be key. So that weird sense that we're coming into the market in order to differ from the Edinburgh, but we might have to resemble it in order to. We talked about it a bit in terms of the logic of politics, really. Cameron, in order to come into power against Labour, needs to first resemble Labour before he can differ from it. And so the other thing that we felt that was kind of missing, I suppose, from the article, just because it wasn't part of its remit, I suppose, was the extent to which the reviews, while having those political and polemical qualities that the literary magazines do, also might be seen to function in quite a different way as sort of journals of record, really. That those articles are long. They're often very instructive, full of information about the world, and they're meant to build into a kind of private archive, a gentleman's library. The quarterly is meant to function as it were a kind of gentleman's library on its own, in a way. And that's ambition, which is actually slightly absent from the, what Scott and Murray and everybody was saying, was clearly part of what was going on, and is quite different perhaps from, Blackwood's and the London Magazine. They're not intended for the libraries of posterity or the libraries of the 19th century in quite that way.
John Gross's book, where he says, the rise and fall of the English man of letters, he says the quarterlies were designed to update the Encyclopaedia Britannica. That's what a quarterly article was meant to do. Whereas the magazine was like joining Three Ring Circus. It was about entertainment, fireworks, irony, satire, humour, like that. And so if you were a magazine writer, the ephemerality of what you were doing, I think, was much more visible. Whereas if you were a quarterly reviewer, that was something much more dignified. So we were talking in our group about the humorlessness of those two. They're slashing, but you don't read the quarterly for a laugh. There are no laughs. You don't think that's true? Okay, good.
Well, what was, I've been reading a lot of them, and
right.
I think they are absolutely designed to entertain.
Entertain,
and they're
okay.
often very pointically topical. I mean, they may masquerade as general knowledge, but they're clearly aimed at events in a way, with a different spin. I mean, the weeklies and the dailies, they're following things on the ground. The quarterlies pretend to be talking about, things from a great height, but actually they are also gathering energy from events as they unfold.
Yeah.
And I think, yes, there's a huge amount of... I mean, Gifford was famous as a
Yes,
satirist.
that's it.
And he demanded satire, I think, from his contributors.
Yeah.
And Croker, of course, was the great specialist.
Yeah.
And I think Geoffrey too in the Edinburgh. I mean, he takes on that sort of lofty, legalistic role as a reviewer, but I think he often does that with a certain amount of irony. I mean, the reviews of the late poets, most obviously, they're quite funny, and he knows there's something sort of hyperbolic about the stance he's taking to say the excursion. I think there's something quite sort of knowing and sort of semi-satirical about Geoffrey as a reviewer.
Actually, the monthlies often seem to be more stodgy.
Oh God, I find it okay.
Well, you know, they're just sort of work-a-day kind of. We're going to churn through all the stuff that's been published. Not really very sparky. Whereas there's more of a voice, isn't there, in the quarterly.
Yeah, I mean, just to corroborate that, I remember a bit from Robinson's diary where he was talking about Coleridge, trying to explain to Lamb and others what's happened to Southey and how he can be so nasty in conversation now. It's because he never did that before he started reviewing. The reviewing does things to you, and he's changed his writing style and his personality. They often deplore, don't they? He talks about it as the age of personality.
Coleridge,
and that's what he means, isn't it? I mean, so that sort of the tone. It might not even be just an individual writer, although it could be, but the tone of the reviews and that sense of a kind of drive and a polemical or satirical edge, for him being the problem with this, with the reviewing culture. But it's definitely there.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm not sure who the person is. It
was me.
Okay.
Yeah, we didn't let you, Rob.
Damn it!
No, seriously, he did say no. Yeah, we started off talking, and though Matt will correct me if I'm wrong. Just fill in if I miss out bits. We started off talking about the freedom we consider offered to readers in the reading of a miscellany or a magazine, and that became the kind of premise from which we thought about some of these propositions, particularly the Richard Cronin piece.
Is that the piece you did, John? Sorry.
That's the piece we did.
Okay,
yeah,
sorry.
but we tried to answer all three questions, Prof.
Go on then.
But we started off in the position of freedom and the way in which readers had their own autonomy to decide to read selectively, which is deeply inscribed, I think, in most of our own experience of reading magazines today. So we began from that, so that magazines or miscellanies might appeal and allow for a broader curiosity to inform the process or even the sequence or the order of reading things. So to some extent the dream of mastery of being an editor and being able to dictate the course of reading, we thought was probably delusional, to say the least. Similarly, the prospect that you presented us with helpfully at the beginning, which is that the editor of MAGA would want the audience to also read the London magazine. Well, we also consider the prospect, well, vice versa. And then what? So what you've immediately set up, as I think Kim Wheatley's article addresses, is the unmanageability of that scenario, where you've got two sets of communities, each wanting to read the other, but an actual audience that also extends those communities beyond writers to an audience, which becomes its own creature, which becomes its own unmanageable monsters, shall we say, which we'll come on to later. So that was some of the first things that we were talking about. Then we focused mainly on the Cronin, which we all three of us found really quite interesting. We started off talking about whether it was a manifestation of a superannuated code of honour, a manifestation of aristocratic, a chivalric code that couldn't be made applicable to this new form of print culture. And so we began from that prospect, which still, I think, informs certainly my view of it, and possibly the other two as well. That in other words, the non-fit in that model which Cronin is wanting to apply to print culture. I mean, as a sign of how print culture works, we, I suppose, also want to have that historical reference of honour, the code of honour, also pushed back away from it. In other words, it doesn't function in this tragic episode, 2 episodes that he deals with. And maybe there's also a degree to which it won't function as a suitable analogy to totally describe, well, what would the semiotics of print culture within the magazines within this period. Within that, I think we then went on to talk about managing, because it seems to us that perhaps the great moral of certainly of the John Scott case, and it's the same guy, isn't it, involved in Hazlitt and Libra Morris, who tries out Sarah. Basically, don't get this guy Pat Morris involved. His 2 contributions to literary history are both disastrous. But seriously, it's about. We talked. I thought quite interestingly about mismanagement and about the delusion of management, which I thought was very relevant to me, really, as head of school at the current time. And in some ways, it's about that kind of myth of thinking that you can manage this relationship. And going back to, which was Matt's point, I mean, going back to Richard's paper yesterday, the difference, perhaps, as much as Cronin's analogy might be instructive and rich in some ways, also the fact that it might not work. In other words, what Richard was positing and looking for with his view of Fraser's magazine was an ethical code that would be suitable for a new professionalised cadre of writers in the 1830s. And what was mistakenly being used, tragically being used, was a superannuated tool born of aristocratic codes of honour, which failed miserably to do the job, because what it wasn't addressing was professional ethics, but a raw kind of identity where you want still to operate as if writing can be redeemed by face-to-face contact of one-on-one life on death. And what actually is needed is, such as agreements today of a professional kind, which might be able to deal with identity as manifest in writing, in print culture, which is highly mediated and therefore doesn't lead to, getting shot, basically. Anyway, I'll end at that point. So I think that's probably enough. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing that was all the sort of, we focused a lot on that. I mean, one of the things I found was, I think it was Matt's point yesterday about how it would be interesting to see if actually it's quite a small group of people who are involved in that. And I think that's one of the things that you notice when you read paper pellets and stuff. It's just Walter Scott crops up, and actually this is all just a small kind of coterie to a degree, people that are all involved. And your comment about Patmore sort of shows that as well. That he's also involved in other things, and that's sort of actually how broad are we talking about? Was the other thing that came that, and Scotland, which has kind of not been talked about, like feels like this could have been in Edinburgh really as well. Publishing and why London and compared to and the Scottish influence.
I think we talked a little bit more about the Scottish thing. Since my take on this is also derived from the work I've done on boxing, which sits side by side, and obviously is part of Richard's study as well. But I was thinking of Scott's short story, The Two Drovers, in which the drover who is still working with a clan mentality comes down, driving the cattle down into Westmoreland, and has a dispute in a tavern, and then because he thinks his honour has been impugned or challenged, murders an English guy with his dirk. I think it's a dirk, and he does that, very much a typical Scot, with, as it were, an outmoded form of honour. And I think reading, that was very strongly in my mind, reading that alongside Cronin's. Maybe the Scottish element is not sufficiently inscribed with the degree to which it's not doing things if you look at it from a pugilistic sense, within the period, I mean, you'd say, well, don't do that. You solve the dispute in the good English way. The English way of solving a dispute is to use fists, not a knife, not the dagger of the assassin. And that's very dominant within this period, within the popular culture of the time. So even boxing, one might say, as carried out within the Romantic period, is one step ahead of what's taking place in the dueling. And in some ways, boxing is designed culturally to replace dueling institutionally within lots of the practices within this period. So I mean, so I don't know. I suppose I would think conflict, yes, but maybe the way in which boxing is more highly mediated and does not, in quite the same way, involve presence. Actually, might be just a further complication to the scenario.
Yeah. So they're using metaphors of boxing in the reviews.
Yeah.
Do you understand that?
Yeah. I mean, very. It's quite.
The fancy,
I mean, this is a palpable hit, etc.
Because it allows it to go on, and that's the thing we sort of.
That was the other really good point. The other really good point. The really good point was yours, wasn't it? Which was about. Do you want to go?
No, I mean, I think you talked about it in the way the earlier point, but it did seem interesting that what happens in this, there's this tension between the sort of honour code of sort of a dueling that, to a degree, you have to call someone out, you have to sort of throw it down, but there's a sort of comfort in that you're going to just gentlemanly miss potentially. The last thing you need is for it to end. Because your point before we all broke off, the second point was that this conflict has to continue. That somebody says one thing, you then riff off that, and then another thing develops from it, and it's this sort of creative potential. But once someone's dead, or once the magazine falls apart, I mean, Kroning's is just that individual represents that magazine, and it all extrapolates from that. If you finish that person off, the conflict ends, and the creativity ends. And so the last thing you want, which is why the boxing thing, I guess, potentially becomes a way of mapping onto that, because it allows the development.
I mean, you don't want Muhammad Ali shooting Joe Frazier. You want to generate copy by having the rematch. I mean, at the current state, boxing has got into where there's always a rematch. It's always productive of more, isn't it?
Right. You want to sell magazines.
Yeah.
You want to fight, but you want to sell magazines.
It's productive of copy.
And a culture can develop from that as well.
That's right.
So you have people writing about those.
And then you've got readers who join in and take. And then that's.
But that was very modern and commercial and exists at one side, and in contrast with, the 1790s, the setting up of the reviews in the early 1800s, where it really is a political game of trying to suppress the other voice. I mean, those things coexist, don't they? That idea that actually the political stakes are so high, we really do want to shoot the Edinburgh out of the water, or we do really want to suppress the analytical review.
Well, they Moore and who fights the duel? Moore and out of the Edinburgh Review, Moore and Jeffrey, and Byron is apoplectic when Byron's drunk. What did he say? I'm drunk for a week or something. When Broom's English Bards and Scotch Reviewers, that review of Ours Vileness comes out. He say I'm drunk for a week. He was drunk for. He was at Cambridge. He was. Okay.
I just had a question, because you were talking about print culture, but I also wondered about print culture and visual culture, because there's some very famous caricatures of Duke of Wellington fighting duels and stuff like that. Is there the same visual response to the boxing content, the boxing contest? Because I can't think of anything. But the duels, shooting or sword plays, I can think of very famous caricatures.
I'm trying to think of caricatures. I can think of there are visual representations,
Well, Jericho does a very famous engraving of a boxing match.
Exactly.
But it's not a contest because you defended somebody. It's a
that is in some ways that's a speculation on the sublime body, isn't it? In a kind of homoerotic way. Actually,
and it's a London scene. So it's
yeah.
What about in Life in London? Is there anything? Does Cruikshank do any pugilism in Life in London?
But what are you looking for? You're looking for they go to Gentleman Jackson's And
Advice.
Yeah, they do that.
but are you looking for caricatures of battles between politicians and between writers that are represented pugilistically? I can't think of any of those.
No.
But there's lots of images of boxers.
Yeah.
I mean, just as and I mean the 1820s. I take it after. What's very strong in your argument is that it's around the time of Scott and after. There are loads of articles in both Blackwood's and the London Magazine about boxing, and almost as if they're trying. It's directly contemporary. As if they're trying out the model that this might be a better way of disagreeing.
The end of De Quincey's first essay on murder considered one of the fine arts. It ends. They box. They box and box and box and box and roll.
I think McGinn in Blackwood says of himself, I think, or maybe of Christopher North, the fictional editor, that he's always willing to throw a cross buttock in honour of church and state, which is amazing.
Not easy to achieve.
But even while they're boxing, they're trying to insinuate that the other side isn't capable of it. I mean, the letter to Pierce Egan by John Wilson, isn't it? Sort of saying, you shouldn't be printed alongside. You shouldn't have mentioned Hazlitt. We shouldn't have used, extract of Hazlitt in this Balking Anecdotes because, this, Cockney never had a heart to play fives. They're not men enough to engage in this battle, even while engaging in a battle with them. Essentially.
And there's also that the kind of that terrible sense from Scott and others that they're undervalued in the culture. Where there's the famous statement of which involves the phrase, one black bruiser is worth more than 1,000 golden poets. so that prints of the boxers massively outsell the most popular fiction of the period. And that there's a kind of resentment within the literary culture, understandably, that's so.
Okay. Can I go to this group? I don't know who was the...
It's me, but feel free to stop me if I mangle anything or forget anything, which is quite plausible at this stage. I suppose we were looking at the Hunt introduction, but we use it as a sort of basis to talk about more general questions. And I suppose because it was the only one of the texts that was sort of focused on an individual, so I think questions of agency came up naturally quite a lot there. I'll just sort of run through the three questions. I mean, in terms of writing well, and we talked about, throughout I think we talked about the relationship between the economic and the ideological, and the sort of intertwining of those imperatives in periodicals, which I think has come up already, and the difficulty perhaps of, though one or the other might have the upper hand at a certain time, the difficulty of disentangling the two. And so we talked about, for a start, the sort of economic imperatives that might have helped periodical writing to flourish, technologies, price of paper and so on, but also, and as a result of that, the high payments that the best contributors could achieve. Perhaps the competitiveness of trying to get into the best paying journals. But we also talked about the sort of dangers and anxieties that one sees at the time might also affect us, or some of us as critics, that there's a certain, because of the pressure to write quickly and perhaps the incentive to write a lot quickly, the dangers of sort of of verbiage, the long flowing sentences, the sort of use of apposition where the sort of same idea keeps getting repeated and retreaded in various iterations, and Hazlitt got a lot of sort of criticisms for that, among others. So the sort of dangers of fluency, I suppose. And we talked about the idea of reading well, and whether, not necessarily in the Ainsworth, but whether one might see that in a sort of derogatory sense, that, you know, a lot of the criticism of periodicals at the time was it was sort of sound and fury but signifying nothing. There was just all this sort of stuff. And I suppose we talked about issues of the sort of corporate nature of periodicals and anonymity, and the need to try and find a distinctive voice, but within an anonymous environment. So the use of pseudonyms, but that's complicated by the fact that multiple authors might use the same pseudonym. So we didn't sort of reach any conclusions
we
there.
sort of made distinctions about the different types of periodical, weeklies, monthlies, quarterlies, and the way in which weeklies perhaps have a more distinctive individual voice, not familiar with the work of one person identifiably.
Yes.
So the question arises in different ways and different types of serial publication.
Yeah, sort of issues of scale, wasn't it? Which also affects the idea of leadership and management. The relationship between the sort of quarterly juggernaut and the more nimble weeklies. The ways in which different sorts of journals might have larger networks or smaller networks of contributors, and also the way in which there might be more, like a big hitting review in the quarterly might need to have more ideological valency, might need to be more edited than a sort of, a short squib in the New Monthly, something like that. So I suppose we talked about how with different sorts of journals, the question of how much you can attribute to individuals in terms of their management might vary. The extent to which some journals might be managed in a much more sort of corporate way than others. So, and I suppose we thought a bit about the Susan Oliver article actually, and that we thought it was really interesting. It makes some quite big claims about Johnson and about a sort of democratic ethos with not just in terms of the content, but the sort of structure of the analytical review. And we were wondering whether one of the problems with dealing with periodical writing is there's not always the evidence base to find out how things were managed. Sometimes there's a lot of evidence, as with the weekly article, but sometimes there's very little. And you're sort of trying to extrapolate from John talked about this right at the start, so you're trying to extrapolate process from the output, and that's quite difficult to do.
Especially when it's something some magazines are working very, very hard to make it as obscure and murky and complicated and baffling as they possibly can.
Yeah, Blackwood's being the perfect case in point.
Right. I mean, people still think that John Wilson edited it because William Blackwood did such a magnificent job of throwing people off the scent. It was part of the mystery of the magazine. How does this get produced? Who's doing this?
And I think that we made some progress with the third. We talked about the Cronin thing and the ideas of cooperative antagonism. This ties in with the previous group. I think there was the issue of how it's. I mean, I really like Cronin's book. I think it's a fantastic book, but how plausible that analogy is of dueling in terms of a very sort of complicated and diverse periodical culture. And we wondered perhaps if we might think of the readers of these journals, who often were sort of promiscuous in their reading, as forming something much more like a community than the actual periodical culture in itself, which might be seen as much more tribal than that. Though I know there was some fluidity in terms of different journals. I think that's as far as we've got. Does anyone want to add anything? Oh yeah, we came back again to mapping and networking and Venn diagrams, which I'm sure we'll talk about at the end of the day as well.
Yeah, I can feel Venn diagrams coming at the end of the day for sure. Okay? Yeah.
We did look at the Oliver article, and David has preempted for some things we would be saying. We started with Robert making the point that, unlike the other articles, the other journals we're talking about, which had great longevity, this one, the analytical review, basically existed for a decade, I think, 1788 to 1798. And as Susan Oliver points out, the analytical ceased publication shortly before Johnson went to jail for 6 months in February. Well, she takes that, she tries to put the argument and say the trouble is not having evidence, that it isn't so much the content of the radical content, it's the unusual editorial structure. But so she used the phrase like their rejection of a standard autocratic editorial model, a successful structural model of print democracy. But we didn't find evidence of this in the article. And I was mentioning the older Marilyn Gall article, which we didn't have, Joseph Johnson, Literary Alchemist, where I don't know if this still holds good, but Marilyn Gall argues, first of all, that Johnson wasn't as strongly political. He published the Analytical Review, but he also published, I think, the Monthly Review, that he published, in a way, much more wrongly, Catholically, wrong phrase to use. But what he did do, in terms of community, was the cherishing his authors and the conversations and the dinners, and that's where the creativity came from. And Rob was pointing out that just the fact that Joseph Johnson is is put in jail for 6 months, then this journal folds and never picks up again. Whereas Leigh Hunt carries on writing from prison, and there's things like the Quarterly and the Edinburgh, if you base it too much on one personality, or there's a democratic structure where somehow all this is happening, but we have, I say, there's just no evidence for this, then who picks up the reins and it doesn't take off? So a sort of a journal of its time. But I say the creativity, we came back to this thing that the creativity could often be in antagonism rather than through, and also the point that not all radicals thought alike, that they all sit around agreeing as like the whole mass of Guardian readers, and we just, don't squabble. It seemed to be, again, closing down the sense of what radicalism was. So, do you add more?
That's good. Yeah.
William.
Just throw this in as something I'm picking up from history of business studies at the cutting edge, where they're trying to see, I think, whether a Darwinian model can be applied to the success of corporations.
Mm-hmm.
Pan Am was the great company, gone. Nokia's gone. And, what's the other one's gone?
Blackberry's
Blackberry's gone. There is an inability to adapt, which you can see if you look at corporations. And the studies take the form of, well, in a Darwinian model, it's obvious you have to do this, you have to respond to what the competition do. But because they have their own culture, they are unable to adapt in many cases. So you don't, with exceptions of course, but on the whole, corporations do not adapt. They either change absolutely or they go under. And I think if you were to take a long look at literary reviews from maybe the critical in the 18th century through to the mid-Victorian period or something, then you might find that there are, Gentleman's Magazine disappears and others come up. The Darwinian way of looking at it, with an internal culture and a reluctance to adapt, might give you an overarching theory.
So what's interesting about that, the Darwinian model, it's not the survival of the fittest means it's not a race. It's not a 100-meter race to see who's first, is it? It's about niches.
It's about niches.
It's about
yes,
there've been
exactly.
plenty of, you need to find out where your gap or your
That's right.
space is, and if you do that, you might survive.
That's right.
It's amazing to watch some of the. Blackwood starts in October 1817, and it folds in December 1980. It goes nearly 164 years. And we talked a little bit in our group about cultural communities and the fact that we want them to last. Like Jane said about the analytics, sort of had its moment, and there is something in that. But there is also a sense in which these things are founded, and we hope that they endure. And what makes a cultural community successful presumably has to be that they are able to adapt in some ways to whatever.
Well, Blackwoods is a great example because the first 6 months of Blackwoods are a damn squib, aren't they?
Yeah. I think they're better. Well, sorry.
No.
I'm too oppositional.
Pose away.
I think the first 6 months of Blackwoods, William Blackwood didn't think they're Tory enough. But I think that they're actually... James Hogg publishes a fantastic series in the first 6 months, and there's a really good review of Manfred in the first 6 months. And Scott publishes a few... William Blackwood didn't like it, because it wasn't angry enough. He didn't think it was going to make a mark.
They don't have the impact of the later.
Yeah, but I think the first 6 issues are actually better than we give them credit for. Can I say that? Yeah, that's okay. Yeah, but it does adapt.
Yes, on the subject of antagonism, I hope you don't mind if I say something very disputatious. I mentioned to you yesterday that I really bristled at the Cronin piece. And, I was sort of pleased to hear from you a sort of very calm, well-reasoned objection to the way in which he uses the duel as the model for print culture. But yes, I think it's a really problematic piece, and I've heard him give not very long ago wonderful sort of subtle and clever paper on the beginnings of Jane Austen's literary career. Yeah. But I really don't like what he's doing here. I think it's very problematic from a gender point of view, and it's as if he wakes up to that himself about sort of 2/3 of the way through. He suddenly realizes how exclusionary it's going to be, and starts coming up with a few excuses. I can only call them that because they're not very persuasive. So I think it's the difference between, the old style romanticism saying we're only going to talk about male authors because they're the only ones that matter, and female writers are just out of the picture, and saying, well, unfortunately, because of this remasculinization of the literary public sphere, and the fact that the dual becomes the paradigmatic model for literary production, we can't talk about women writers, so we're only going to talk about male writers. I think perhaps it actually feeds into the very idea that you put forward, because the print culture dual is different. It just is different, and women can participate in it. I mean, you could look, for instance, at the career of Sidney Owenson, which was a kind of career-long duel with Croker, and I would claim that Barbauld is also dueling with Croker. Jane Austen, in more subtle ways, is dealing with various sort of cultural figures. So, it just doesn't work, I don't think, and I find it very dubious and retrograde what he's doing.
But is it the fact that he's assuming that duels exclude women that's the problem, or is it the model of the duel?
It's this, the sort of practice of the duel being used as a metaphor for what goes on in print culture and antagonisms and debates. It just, because it has all that baggage of gender with it. I mean, of course, there's gender valences to antagonism in the literary public sphere, but I think it's terribly important that women can participate in it, even if it's rare. And he seems to think that the rarity is a reason for not addressing it at all.
I mean, I absolutely agree. I mean, I think there's a kind of considered reflex, isn't there, of John Scott's wife and children, that manifests itself late on in the ruminations within that piece. But in some ways, it seems to me that domestic scene, which is precisely what John Scott tragically rules out of the equation. I mean, it was one of those, dare I say, one of those occasions, as I said to these two, where very rare occasion for me, where I thought, hooray for Robert Souther. where all of a sudden he says, well, the question you have to ask is, how many children do you have? And then of course it becomes, for more gender, how many daughters? In other words, he has a domestic masculinity that immediately thinks properly of dependence. And in some ways that's the conjured tragic scene lurking behind the foregrounded scene of the duel in this case. But I agree with you, really. But that's there, isn't it? But it's as a kind of secondary reflex rather than integrated within the economy of gender and writing, which might more properly form the whole of that piece. That's one way of putting it.
But if the pugilistic and dual metaphor doesn't work, have you got an alternative? Would it just be conversation?
No. Well, no. I mean, there are real ideological differences, and they are fought out. The metaphors, yes, perhaps have to be chosen more carefully.
Boxing's better because women did it, as they do now.
I didn't know that.
Well, I just wanted to raise a particular case where a woman took issue with all of this, which is Mary Robinson, whose own personal, verbal duels with people led to her productivity. She would write in defense of her honor all the time because she was always being slandered. And in her letter to the women of England, she purposely sets up this anecdote about this woman who kills a man in defense of her honor and I forget how she does it, with a pistol or something, I think. And it's her fiance, I think. But her point is that women should be allowed to duel, that they have every right to the chivalry code of honor to defend their word and their honor. She makes it very clear that dueling is all about defending your word, that it is a matter of writing, and that her duels take place on the page, and that she should not be read as this authoress who is a scandalous woman, but as this serious duelist who is taking issue on very important political and social matters. And so here's a woman who's saying, yeah, this is completely unfair, this is completely fraudulent and patriarchal, and damn it, here I am with my sword, and I'm going in.
Is it worth? I mean, one of the things that struck me about Kim Wheatley's piece, when the quarterly reviewers planning their new review, is just how they had the metaphor of war in relation to the Edinburgh. What we're declaring war on the Edinburgh.
Yes.
But at the same time, while planning the review, was saying, what we're going to do is insinuate politics into our, that these are just going to be sound moral articles, and our readers, over a period of time, are going to be seduced into Tory principles without knowing. And what's wonderful about the article, but it's also saying that's what's weird about this period as well, isn't it? That both of these models appear to be operating at the same time. It's not all constant ideological conflict, is it? A lot of, tales of terror, or some of the more imaginative and free-floating flights seem to be precisely working toward, according to a kind of, romantic or Schillerian aesthetic of, or model of aesthetic education, alongside these sort of stand-up battles. And it's that kind of competing or intermittent model which, I don't know, what do you think?
One of the things that's emerging for me in these discussions is that any creative community needs to be multifaceted, multi-faced. And it needs to, like Kim Wheatley's article brings out, that it really needs to be like the Edinburgh, but not at all like the Edinburgh. It needs to get in the field. It's got to be seen as a substantial competitor to the Edinburgh, but it can't. We're not even going to mention the Edinburgh, and it's got to be sort of both bold and insinuating at the same time. And maybe that's what makes successful creative communities, that they're able to somehow conjure both those things simultaneously. I just think the periodical press is a really interesting way of thinking about how you get a dynamic creative community that lasts. I went to quarterly. Edinburgh Review folds in 1929. It goes 127 years. So that's plenty of adapting. And I think David's point is an excellent one. Blackwood's magazine starts. Blackwood doesn't like it, fires the editors, and says, "Right, we're going off this way." And he does a magnificent job of responding to a readership that's not deeply engaged.
Would it be possible to say that where other institutions might suffer from such dual aims, from such kind of internal ambivalences, that actually cultural or literary institutions rather thrive by them? Because what you're suggesting is actually the sort of divided aims, wanting to do everything and its opposite, might actually be what creates the writing in a way. And
that's very good.
But that might not be. That's where cultural institutions might be different from museums, say, where if they try and do everything, there might be,
Right. But writing, maybe that's.
I think dual aims as a phrase takes us back to Richard Cronin, doesn't it?